Imagine you are 35,000 feet above the earth, strapped into the left seat of a 180-ton machine hurtling through the sky at 500 miles an hour. And suddenly, in a locked cockpit that contains only two living souls, a woman's voice speaks your name and gives an order that violates every rule in the book. You have exactly 9 minutes to decide whether to call for a doctor or to trust a voice no one else can hear. Captain David Mitchell made that choice on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in September 2025. What happened 5 minutes after takeoff left 180 passengers, an entire airport, and one hardened pilot forever changed. Before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary have reached. And if you haven't yet joined our family, subscribe now, because here, each day, we witness the tender love and mighty power of the Mother of God. David Mitchell was 45, looked 50, and sometimes felt 70. 21 years in the cockpit had carved precise lines around his eyes and turned his movements into something almost mechanical. Shoulder check, seatbelt, headset, checklist, black coffee, no sugar. He flew the way other men breathed, efficiently, without waste, and completely alone. Divorced 5 years earlier, he still wore the pale circle on his ring finger like a scar that had forgotten how to heal. Karen had finally grown tired of competing with flight schedules that changed like weather and goodnight texts sent from hotel rooms on the other side of the planet. Their daughter Emily, now 15, answered his calls with one-word replies and spent birthdays with her mother. David told himself it was fine. Pain was easier when you treated it like turbulence. Acknowledge, adjust, fly through. His apartment was the kind of place real estate agents call low maintenance. White walls, one couch, one television that was never on, a fridge that contained exactly 6 bottles of water and whatever the flight catering left over. No plants, they died. No pets, they needed. No photographs on the walls. They asked questions he had no answers for. At work they called him Ice Mitchell, not cruelly, but with the quiet respect crews give a captain who has never raised his voice and never made a mistake. He liked the nickname. Ice didn't feel. That Tuesday morning began like every other. Alarm at 4:47 a.m. Shower hot enough to scald away the last hotel's memory. Uniform pressed the night before. Black coffee in a travel mug that had circled the globe more times than most people ever would. The crew briefing room smelled of burnt coffee and printer toner. 3 flight attendants he recognized by face, but not by name. And his first officer for the last 6 months. Ryan Torres, 28, earnest, annoyingly awake. Ryan always prayed before a flight, not ostentatiously. He simply bowed his head for 10 silent seconds while the rest of the crew pretended to study weather charts. David had never commented on it. Live and let live, as long as the guy could fly the plane. They walked to the aircraft together, footsteps echoing down the jet bridge. In 1847B, an Airbus A320 that smelled of lemon disinfectant and recycled air. David ran his hand along the fuselage the way some men touch a crucifix, a ritual he would never have admitted was superstition. Inside the cockpit, he dropped into the left seat, the one place on Earth where everything still made sense. Ryan took the right, plugged in his headset, and began the familiar liturgy of checklists. Outside the windshield, the ramp agents moved like dancers in high-visibility vests, baggage carts weaving, fuel trucks hissing. Passengers were boarding, a young family with toddlers already crying, an elderly couple helping each other with carry-ons, businessmen typing final emails, a nun in a gray habit clutching a small wooden rosary, 13 minutes to scheduled pushback. Plenty of time. David reached to adjust the air conditioning when the first strange thing happened. A warmth, soft but unmistakable, wrapped around him like a blanket thrown over his shoulders on a winter morning. It was not the vent. The pack flow was still on low. He tugged at his collar, suddenly aware of sweat prickling along his hairline. "Ryan, is it warm in here, or is it just me?" The co-pilot glanced at the temperature display. 22 degrees, Captain. Feels normal. David was about to shrug it off when the second thing arrived. The scent of roses, fresh, intoxicating, as though someone had opened the cockpit door and carried in an armful of blooms straight from a Mediterranean garden. But the door was locked, the cabin still sealing, and there were no flowers within 100 meters. He turned his head sharply, searching for the source. Nothing. The smell grew stronger, richer, until it filled his lungs like incense in an ancient cathedral. His pulse quickened. 21 years of flying, and he had never once felt claustrophobic in a cockpit. Yet suddenly the space felt too small, too full of something he could not name. And then came the voice, clear, calm, unmistakably feminine, and close enough that the tiny hairs on his neck rose as if someone stood directly behind him. Take off now. David froze, fingers suspended above the glare shield, heart slamming against his ribs. The voice had spoken inside the cockpit, inside his head, inside his very bones. He whipped around. Empty space. Only Ryan, calmly entering fuel figures, oblivious. Ryan, his own voice cracked like a teenager's. Did you hear that? Hear what, Captain? A voice. A woman's voice. Ryan looked up, concern flickering across his face. David saw the thought form behind the younger man's eyes. Stress, fatigue, early signs of something worse. But before Ryan could speak, the voice returned, urgent now, almost pleading. Take off now, David. Now. It knew his name. The cockpit, always a sanctuary of logic and steel, had become a place where the impossible pressed in from every side. David's hands hovered over the controls, trembling as though the yoke itself had turned to ice. The scent of roses was no longer a fragrance. It was a presence, thick and living, wrapping around his throat like the sweetest incense and the heaviest chain at the same time. Sweat slid down his spine in cold rivulets. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the runway numbers painted far ahead, the countdown clock on the upper display still reading 10 minutes and 42 seconds until scheduled departure, and the calm, worried face of Ryan Torres. The voice came a third time, gentle yet edged with steel. David, take off now. He had faced engine fires at V1, wind shear on short final, once even a bird strike that took out half the windshield over the Rockies, and never once had his pulse spiked like this. Because those were things he understood. Those had procedures. This had none. Ryan, he heard himself say, and the word came out hoarse, almost foreign. We're leaving. Right now. The co-pilot's head snapped up. Captain, we're still 9 minutes early. Ground hasn't even given pushback clearance. I don't care. Request immediate clearance. Tell them we have a hot brake indication or whatever you need to say. Just get us moving. Ryan stared for one heartbeat. 2, searching David's face for the joke, the mistake, the hidden camera. He found none. What he found instead was something that frightened him more than any mechanical failure ever could. The absolute, unshakable certainty in his captain's eyes. Ryan had flown with men who panicked and men who froze. He had never flown with a man who looked like he had just received orders from a higher authority than the airline, the FAA, or even physics itself that he picked up the handset. Ground. This is N1847B requesting immediate push and taxi for departure. We have a time-critical operational issue. The ground controller's voice crackled back, laced with irritation. You're 9 minutes ahead of slot time. Negative. Hold position. David snatched the radio from Ryan's hand before the younger man could respond. Tower, this is Captain David Mitchell. I need immediate clearance for takeoff. I cannot disclose the nature of the emergency on open frequency, but I am declaring it now. Clear the runway. There was a silence, so complete David could hear the blood roaring in his ears. He could picture the tower cab, controllers exchanging glances, someone pulling up the flight plan, another reaching for the red phone that went straight to the airport director. Declaring an emergency without visible cause was career suicide. It would trigger investigations, drug tests, psych evals, maybe the end of everything he had left. He didn't care. Finally, the voice returned, calm and almost amused. Cleared for immediate takeoff, runway 27 left. Wind calm. Godspeed. The tower controller's voice followed a split second later, shaken. In 1847B, cleared for immediate takeoff, runway 27 left. Traffic is clear. Ryan's eyes were wide. Captain, notify the cabin. Seats for takeoff in 60 seconds or less. Go. Ryan hit the intercom. His usual smooth announcement voice cracked as he spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the co-pilot. Please return to your seats and fasten your seat belts immediately. We have been cleared for departure. The cabin erupted in confusion. Trays clattering, a child crying, someone still halfway down the aisle with a suitcase. David didn't wait. He released the parking brake, advanced the thrust levers, and the A320 began to roll while the seatbelt sign was still chiming its frantic warning. Flight attendants scrambled, literally pushing passengers into seats and slamming overhead bins with trembling hands. David taxied faster than he ever had in his life, skipping the usual lazy S-turns, taking the high-speed turn-off almost at a jog. Behind him, he could hear the senior flight attendant's voice over the PA, tight with barely controlled fear. Arming doors, cross-check, and verify. The runway threshold rushed toward them. David lined up without slowing, shoved the thrust levers forward, and the engines answered with a roar that drowned out everything. Doubt, procedure, the frantic questions from the cabin. V1. Rotate. The nose lifted. Wheels left the ground 5 minutes and 11 seconds ahead of schedule, climbing into a sky that had never looked so wide, so merciful. For a moment, there was only the familiar vibration of flight, the green lights on the ECM, the gentle pitch of the autopilot engaging. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The scent of roses faded as softly as morning mist. The warmth dissolved from his skin, and in its place came a peace so deep it felt almost like grief. He looked over at Ryan, whose knuckles were white on the side stick. The younger man's lips were moving, barely audible. A prayer. David didn't mock it this time. They had only just passed 2,000 feet when every radio channel died at once. Not static, not interference, just a sudden, total void, as if the entire world below had been unplugged. David keyed the mic twice, his voice still ragged from the shock that had gripped him moments earlier. Departure. In 1847, be climbing through 2,000 for 5,000. Nothing came back except the cold, empty hiss of dead air. Ryan flicked through frequencies, tower, ground, approach, even the universal emergency guard, with the same result. Every light on the communication panel glowed green. The fault was not in the aircraft. The fault was on the ground. David rolled the Airbus gently left, keeping the airport within gliding reach the way procedure demanded when you lost comms, and glanced back over his shoulder. That was when they saw the smoke, a towering column of black, rolling furiously upward from the exact corner of the terminal where gate C-17 had been, their gate, the jet bridge still attached to their aircraft only minutes before. This was no small galley fire, no electrical short. It was a monstrous plume, thick and violent, punching into the sky faster than any of them had ever seen, already higher than the control tower and still swelling into a grotesque mushroom cap that swallowed the sun. At its base, orange flames danced and roared, devouring everything they touched. Ryan's voice came out as a strangled whisper. "My God, that's exactly where we were parked." David felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. If they had waited the scheduled 9 minutes, if he had argued with the tower, if he had dismissed that impossible voice as fatigue or madness, the Airbus would have been sitting directly in the heart of that inferno, with 180 living souls aboard. The young family whose toddlers had been crying during boarding, The elderly couple who needed help with their bags, the mother clutching two small children, the businessman finishing one last email, the quiet nun in the gray habit, fingering her rosary. Behind them, the cabin exploded into chaos. Passengers on the left side had the same horrifying view. The first scream pierced the air, then spread like wildfire. Phones rose in a trembling forest, flashes popping, children wailing, adults clutching one another. A man in row 24 began reciting the Our Father in Spanish, his voice shaking but growing louder, as though the ancient words could build a wall between them and the death they had just escaped by seconds. The flight attendants, trained for decompression and severe turbulence, now hurried down the aisle with faces drained of color, trying to calm passengers who already knew, in their bones, how close they had come. Ryan turned to David, eyes wide, his rosary now wrapped so tightly around his fingers that the knuckles had gone white. "Captain, the roses. I smelled them too. I thought I was imagining it, so I didn't say anything. But it was roses, overwhelming, and there was no source, nothing." David couldn't speak. His throat had closed like a fist. He could only nod once, slowly, and keep staring at the column of smoke until the airport slipped behind the wing and the horizon finally swallowed it whole. The way the sea swallows a nightmare you barely outran. 20 minutes later, without warning or explanation, the radios crackled back to life. The controller's voice sounded shaken to the core. "In 1847B, we just had a major incident on the ground. Confirm you are airborne and safe." David pressed the transmit button, and for the first time in 21 years of flying, his voice broke across an open frequency. "Affirmative. Airborne and safe. 180 souls on board. Thank you for the clearance." A long, trembling silence. Then, almost inaudible, "Copy that, sir. Godspeed." For the rest of the flight, the cabin fell into a strange, reverent hush. No one demanded explanations anymore. Many simply held each other and wept quietly. An elderly woman in 27A crossed herself every time the seatbelt sign chimed. Someone started to applaud the crew, then thought better of it. Applause felt profane in the face of what had truly happened. When they taxied to the gate 3 hours later, the story was already blazing across every screen on Earth. A ruptured fuel bowser had collided with a catering truck directly beneath their jet bridge. The explosion was instantaneous. Jet fuel turned the entire gate area into a furnace. 4 ground workers died immediately. 27 more were burned or trapped when the structure collapsed. But in 1847B had pushed back 5 minutes and 11 seconds early as the engines spooled down and the seatbelt sign went dark. David remained motionless in the left seat. The cockpit felt cavernous now, achingly empty in a way it had never been before. Ryan unbuckled, stood, hesitated. He reached into his flight bag, drew out his simple wooden rosary, and placed it gently on the center pedestal between them. Without a word, he left David alone. David stared at the beads for a long, long time. Then he picked them up. They were still warm from Ryan's hand. The jet bridge locked onto the aircraft with the usual metallic thud, but nothing else felt usual. Passengers spilled out slowly, as though the air itself had thickened. No one rushed for the exit. Instead, they turned to the crew with tears streaming, hugging strangers, kissing the cheeks of flight attendants they had never met before that day. A young father pressed his forehead to David's shoulder and whispered, "Thank you," over and over until his wife gently pulled him away. An elderly nun took David's hand in both of hers, looked him straight in the eyes, and said only, "She was with you, my son." I smelled the roses from row 32. David couldn't answer. His throat had closed again, this time not from fear, but from something far heavier. He stayed in the cockpit long after the last passenger had gone. The airport around them was chaos. Fire crews still hosing down the blackened skeleton of Terminal C, news helicopters thumping overhead, reporters shouting questions at anyone in uniform. Inside the flight deck, the silence pressed like deep water. David unbuckled, stood, and his legs simply gave way. He sank to the floor between the seats, back against the center pedestal, and for the first time since he was a boy, he cried. Great, wrenching sobs that tore out of him like shrapnel. He cried for the 4 ground workers who hadn't made it, for the 27 in burn units, for the children who would never see their fathers again. He cried for the man he had been an hour earlier, cold, certain, untouchable, and for the man he now was, broken open and terrifyingly alive. That night, in a sterile airport hotel that smelled of carpet cleaner and loneliness, David sat fully dressed on the edge of the bed, captain's jacket still on, for gold bars catching the dim lamplight. His hands would not stop shaking. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the smoke, heard the voice, smelled the roses. He saw the faces of the passengers as they filed past him, the mother clutching her toddlers, the businessman who had been complaining about the early departure and now wept openly, the teenage girl who had recorded the whole thing on her phone and kept saying, "We're alive. We're actually alive." Finally, he slid off the bed and onto the carpet. The knees of his uniform trousers pressed into the coarse weave, but he barely felt it. He had no idea how to pray. The words from childhood had rusted shut decades ago. Yet they came anyway, clumsy, raw, unstoppable. I don't know who you are, or what you are, but if that was you, thank you. Thank you for speaking when I had no right to hear you. Thank you for not letting me be the reason 180 people never came home. He stayed there until his knees went numb and the city lights outside the window faded into dawn. The weeks that followed were strange, like living in the aftershock of an earthquake that only he had fully felt. He flew the same routes, signed the same logbooks, drank the same black coffee, but everything inside had shifted. Colleagues noticed the change immediately. Ice Mitchell no longer snapped at maintenance delays or rolled his eyes when a passenger asked for the third blanket. He listened. He smiled, small, genuine smiles that startled people who had worked with him for years. When a new first officer fumbled a call-out, David simply said, "We all have days like that. Next one's yours." And meant it. One Sunday, driving aimlessly after a red-eye, he passed a small Catholic church he must have driven by 1,000 times without seeing. On impulse, he pulled into the parking lot, sat in the car for 10 minutes arguing with himself, then walked inside just as Mass was beginning. He took the very last pew, coat collar up, ready to bolt. The music was simple, the priest's voice gentle, the smell of incense and beeswax candles so thick it punched him in the chest. When everyone knelt, he knelt. When they stood, he stood. He understood almost nothing of the ritual, but he felt the same warmth he had felt in the cockpit, the same impossible roses brushing the edge of memory. At the consecration, the bell rang 3 times, and something inside him broke open again, quietly this time. He stayed until the last person left, then slipped out before the priest could greet him. He returned the next Sunday, and the next, always the back pew, always silent, always leaving before the final blessing so no one would speak to him. But he kept coming back, drawn by a hunger he could not name. 2 months after the incident, his phone rang with a number he hadn't seen in years. "Hello, David. It's Karen." The sound of her voice after so long was a physical blow. They spoke awkwardly at first, about weather, about work, until she finally said, "Emily saw the news. She knows what happened. She asked me to call. She wants to know if you're okay." David closed his eyes, leaned his forehead against the cool hotel window. "Tell her I'm more okay than I've ever been," he said. And for the first time in years, it was the truth. That a few weeks later, he met Emily for coffee. She was taller, beautiful in the fierce way teenagers are, arms crossed, eyes wary. They sat in silence for a long time. Then she pushed a small paper bag across the table. Inside was a single white rose. "I don't know what to believe," she said, voice trembling. "But Mom said you heard something that day. And whatever it was, it saved people. So, thank you for listening." David took the rose with shaking fingers. That night he pressed it between the pages of the small New Testament Ryan had quietly left in his flight bag. Years have passed since that Tuesday in September 2025, but the story has never stopped traveling. It moves quietly now, the way grace often does, whispered between pilots in crew lounges, shared by flight attendants over coffee in distant layover hotels, carried home by passengers who still wake up some nights smelling roses they cannot explain. They call it the Rose's Flight, or simply C-17. And every telling ends the same way. 180 people are alive today because a hardened captain heard a woman's voice in an empty cockpit and, against every instinct, obeyed. David Mitchell still wears the 4 gold bars. He still flies the same narrow-body routes across continents and oceans, still signs the tech log with the same precise handwriting. But anyone who flies with him now notices the small differences. Before engines start, when Ryan, still his favorite first officer, bows his head and traces a silent sign of the cross, David no longer stares out the window pretending not to see. He closes his eyes too. His lips do not move. He has never learned the formal prayers, but in the silence he offers the only one he knows. Thank you for speaking when I had no right to hear it. On long nights over the Atlantic, he sometimes takes out the pressed white rose Emily gave him, now brittle and brown, kept safe in a clear plastic sleeve inside his flight bag. He holds it between gloved fingers and remembers the exact moment the world cracked open and mercy poured through. Karen and he never remarried. Some wounds are too old for that, but they speak now, really speak. Emily spends 1 weekend a month at the apartment that finally has plants on the windowsill and photographs on the walls. She is studying aeronautical engineering, determined to understand the machines her father trusts with his life, and sometimes, when the 3 of them sit down to dinner, the conversation turns to that day. Emily asks questions David still cannot fully answer. Karen simply reaches across the table and squeezes his hand whenever the memory makes his voice catch. The church never opened a formal cause. No commission was formed, no miracles were declared. The archbishop who received David's private letter simply wrote back, "Some graces are given quietly, Captain, so that only the heart that received them will ever fully know." Yet the story has become one of those modern pilgrimages of the sky. Pilots on long layovers in far-off cities light candles before statues of Our Lady of Loretto, the patroness of aviators, and add their own silent intention. "Let me hear if you ever speak." Flight attendants slip holy cards into seat back pockets, just in case. A support group for airline crew who have lived through close calls now begins every meeting with the Hail Mary, because someone who was on that flight once stood up and said, "We were saved by a mother's voice." David himself has never given an interview. When reporters track him down, he smiles politely, says only, "I was doing my job," and walks away. But once, on a red-eye from Sao Paulo to Madrid, a young co-pilot beside him finally worked up the courage to ask the question everyone wants to know. "Captain, do you really believe it was her? The Virgin Mary?" David looked out at the stars for a long time, the way sailors once looked for the North Star. Then he answered, quietly, so only the 2 of them could hear over the whisper of the engines, "I don't know what name heaven uses when it decides to intervene. I only know that on an ordinary Tuesday, when I had nothing left to give and no faith to offer, a voice I did not deserve spoke my name and told me to move. And because I listened, 180 mothers still kissed their children goodnight. 180 people still breathe, still laugh, still sin and repent and try again tomorrow. If that isn't mercy wearing the voice of a mother, then I don't know what mercy is." He turned back to the instruments then, adjusted the heading by 1 degree, and added almost as an afterthought, "And ever since that day, I have never once smelled roses in a cockpit, except when I needed to be reminded that someone is still watching over us up here." The young co-pilot never forgot the answer. Years later, when he became a captain himself, He began every pre-flight briefing the same way. A moment of silence, a deep breath, and the quiet prayer that the sky might always be kind enough to speak when a soul is too proud, too tired, or too empty to ask. Because sometimes heaven does not shout. Sometimes it simply says, in a voice gentle as roses and firm as love itself, take off now. And if we are humble enough, frightened enough, or desperate enough to obey, the miracle is already on its way. Thank you for walking this journey with Captain David and with all of us who still dare to believe that no cockpit, no heart, no matter how cold or empty, is ever truly alone. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs reminding that mercy still speaks, even at 35,000 feet. And the next time you board a flight and smell, for just a second, the faintest trace of roses, smile. Someone may be praying for you. May Our Lady of the Skies hold you always in the palm of her hand. Amen.